everyone, welcome back to our channel.
I'm Tucker, I'm Crema's VP of Product.
And I'm Allison, I am the Director of Product.
And today we're going to be talking about one-on-one specifically for product leaders, but this could apply to anybody in an organization who's managing other people. So Allison and I both have the pleasure of having one-on-ones with each other. I'm Allison's manager, have been for the past several years. But of course, we also have experience of having one-on-ones with many other people within our organization. I meet with every one of our craft directors, and then Allison meets with all of our different product managers. She reports to me, I report to our COO, so we've had plenty of one-on-ones. And Allison, do you want to talk a little bit about your experience with one-on-ones? Because it's a little bit different than mine.
Yes. Once upon a time, I had over 20 direct reports having active one-on-ones. It was a lot of lessons learned there. Now it's a more manageable number, 6 direct reports, but we've gone through the highs and the lows. So we've got some, I think, good experience with one-on-ones, what to do and what not to do.
Maybe we should start first with talking about what are the different types of one-on-ones?
There are lots of different types. The initial one-on-one, the very first one-on-one that you'll ever have with your direct report or your manager. There's the growth or goal-hitting one-on-ones. Those might not recur as frequently as the regular one-on-ones, which is another type. And then ad hoc. So maybe something came up and you need to jump on a quick call to discuss something. So really there's about 4 distinct different types of one-on-ones.
And I think it's also important to know that while there are these distinct different types, you have the initial one-on-one, getting to know somebody, that might be even a phase. It might not just be one meeting. It might be a series of several different one-on-ones at the very beginning. Of course, you have your ad hoc one-on-ones, which we'll get into a little bit, but regular one-on-ones and then growth one-on-ones. That's not to say that with any one-on-one you're not having growth conversations, right? We're going to be talking a little bit today about coaching within these conversations, but when we're talking about growth-oriented one-on-ones, oftentimes those are going to be your goal setting that's happening, quarterly or biannually or whatever the cadence looks like for your organization. Maybe you have it more frequently than that, but I just want to make sure it's clear that we're not saying that regular one-on-ones don't include growth conversations, because it is very important to be thinking about that, especially as a manager conducting and leading these one-on-ones.
What's your favorite type?
I think my favorite type is probably growth one-on-ones, growth-oriented one-on-ones for goal setting, just because that's where we start to get everything out on the floor. And similar to the initial one-on-one, that's not always one conversation. Sometimes, you've experienced this with me, it starts for us, oftentimes, let's say, for example, we are setting Q1 goals. We might be starting conversations about that in December, and you're going away thinking about it. I'm going away and thinking about it. You're coming back with some ideas. I'm reviewing those ideas, giving some suggestions. Coming back to the new year in January, usually about mid-January, we're finally solidifying those and putting them into our growth platform, which we'll talk a little bit about later. That'd be my favorite. What's yours?
I love the initials. It's just so much fun to me. Getting to take on a new team member or meet a new manager, which luckily I haven't had to do. I'm very, very thankful for Tuck, but I've had a lot of team members come on board with the 20 we've talked about. And then with my new 6, it's just great. I leverage a bunch of different online recommendations for initial one-on-ones, but really it's about getting to understand them. What makes them tick, what makes them happy, what level of fulfillment they're looking for in their job and in their role. And it really gives you an opportunity to set the expectation that their success is your success, and set the intention for your relationship together as, mentor, mentee, manager, employee. I love those initial sessions. I think for some people it can kind of throw them for a loop, because we really get into, how are you feeling about this? But I think it kicks the relationship off on the right foot. What are some of the traits of your best one-on-ones?
I think some of the traits that signify a really great one-on-one for me is, one, I'm not spending the entire one-on-one talking. I think that if I leave a one-on-one and I realize I talk the whole time, it's like a facepalm moment. I usually make my own notes of how I am going to improve that in the future, blah, blah, blah. The times that I can spend listening to the other individual, this is not going to be a surprise to you, of course, but maybe it will be to some of our viewers, is that I think that coming in prepared goes a long way on both sides. So part of my weekly routine is to prepare for my weekly one-on-ones. And so each Monday I go in and I prepare. And oftentimes if the other individual has also started to prepare and add in notes about what we're going to discuss. That gives me some time to prime myself for what types of conversations we might need to be having. Maybe there's some research I can be doing. Maybe there's some answers I can try to go get if that's the type of conversation we're having or something. Or maybe there's some follow-ups that I need to do that maybe I forgot about before I jump into that one-on-one. So I need to quickly get into those before I jump into that one-on-one. And so I think the preparation and the listening part of it are two traits that I think have led to probably the most productive and I think fulfilling one-on-ones that I've had so far. Would you agree with those as being good traits, or would you add to it?
I think those are good traits. I'd say another added layer is trust. Some of my favorite one-on-ones, and that with either with you or with somebody that reports to me, are the ones that where we trust each other to just have active dissent and push on each other. I like a challenge personally. That might not be everybody's cup of tea, but I really do, and I think it's an opportunity for growth. So if you have a good amount of trust with one another, you can push into each other. And I think that whether or not you decide to act on any sort of advice or feedback that's given, it gives you an opportunity to explore, new space in whatever issue you're working.
What do you do to ensure that people are preparing well, that people are participating well, whether that's yourself or your direct report?
It's really important to set up from a manager point of view that with my direct reports who are coming to one-on-ones with me, that this is their meeting. It is their time to use however they would like. Maybe the first few times that's a hard thing to make a new pattern or a new habit out of, but eventually it typically clicks. This is their safe space to bring up any issues that are going on, things that they're trying to problem solve, or areas that they're trying to grow in, or ways that they need a critical thinking partner. It's really their time. I might bring some stuff to the table. I typically always have a handful of questions in my back pocket or items that I want to catch up on, but ultimately it's their time. And giving them that ownership and that level of responsibility and accountability can tend to a bit more engagement than, okay, well, we're just gonna meet every 2 weeks and it is what it is. No, putting it on their plate is, this is how you help yourself grow and to use how you see fit. That's been really helpful from a managerial point of view. From the reportee, I take that same initiative. I typically come into those meetings with you with a list of things that I either want to complain about, get advice about, like who knows, who knows. But it makes me feel really heard and fulfilled if I know that I can bring those things and you're open to talking about them.
I set the expectation. So when I have somebody new reporting to me early on, I set these expectations in our initial one-on-ones of it being their meeting, of what a good one-on-one looks like, what I expect of them, what they should expect of me. And I think that always sets us off on the right foot. I do, however, have a huge advantage because the people that I'm having one-on-ones with are conducting one-on-ones with the rest of the company. They know what it feels like to have good one-on-ones because they've been in the boat where people haven't come prepared or aren't participating well. So they generally know how to conduct themselves in a one-on-one. It doesn't require a ton of coaching beyond setting those initial expectations. I have had experience in the past where things have started to go stale. And that's kind of our next point here, is to talk a little bit about what do you do when maybe the one-on-ones are just starting to fall flat. They don't seem like folks are participating as much, or there's something there. Kind of how have you started to handle that as that's happened throughout your career?
That's a great question. It's a hard one too, because I think it's hard to recognize when it's going stale. There's not necessarily a pattern out there for you to recognize, oh, things are getting stale. It varies case by case. So if things go pretty stale for a while and you're maybe scratching your head on things to do to give it new life, you can use a different framework or system or process, maybe even a workshop. Flip it on its head completely and use that time to rethink the working relationship and the goals that you have together, the growth goals of that individual. Give yourself a pause to bring new life into it. You kind of make your own rules in the one-on-one. So if you notice it getting stale, like, don't be afraid to try new things to breathe new life into that very important session.
When that happens for me, I like to start to think about what might be the root causes of that. Are they overwhelmed? Do they have a lot on their plate right now? I start to think about the things that I might be doing that's influencing that dynamic as well. Am I not bringing my best self to the one-on-ones? Are they not really seeing value in that time with me anymore? And is it something that they just feel obligated to do. And I try to start there to figure out maybe what might be happening that's causing that dynamic. Thankfully, it doesn't happen very often, but and sometimes it is a signifier that, okay, maybe we've only been in work mode too long. Maybe we haven't had a moment to just be human together. And maybe we need to go grab lunch or go grab a drink or go grab breakfast or coffee or whatever. Maybe we need something that's a different environment to have just a human-to-human conversation to maybe better understand maybe why that's happening. And it could just be maybe something else is happening in their personal life that might not even be related to work that's causing them to disengage a little bit. But I think it's important to kind of take a step back as a leader first and understand how you might be influencing the situation before kind of putting it on the other person as being their fault or something like that. Kind of shifting gears here a little bit. When do you feel like is a good time to provide constructive feedback within a one-on-one, or is it ever a good time to provide feedback?
Great question. It depends. So hopefully when you are setting up a new one-to-one relationship with a peer or a reporting team member, you can establish some norms around feedback. I would highly suggest that you do constructive feedback and praise when you're talking about this, but you need to gauge when and how they want that feedback delivered to them. I, for one, have certain team members that prefer it in a one-to-one setting. They want to be able to talk about it, go back and forth, discuss it in those sessions, and they don't care if it's, a few days after it's happened. They still just want that one-to-one time. I have the majority of other team members who don't. They want it on the fly as it's occurring. So let's jump on a call after an instance. Maybe we need to give constructive or praise, and they want to handle it in the moment. But person to person, I'd say most of the time, I would recommend giving feedback as it happens, because that's typically when it's going to be the most impactful. But if it's truly that person's preference to have it in a one-on-one setting, then defer to their preference, because that's what really matters the most.
Yeah. I feel like a lot of times the approach that I take with this, it's similar to what you're saying, but maybe slightly differs, is that I tend to be somebody who is going to give the feedback right away as it occurs, and then offer up the opportunity if they want to discuss it further, that we go into it deeper during the one-on-one. We give them time to process it a little bit, time to think about it, give them some space, and then we can dive deeper around what that meant, whether there's additional context they want to provide as to why something happened in that moment. Because one of the things about, this isn't a video about providing feedback, which maybe we'll do next, but one of the things that is important on providing feedback is trying to do it as quickly as possible and in as short as time as possible, like between meetings, for example. Not all feedback can be given that way, but most of the feedback we're trying to give is typically something that can be given in about 2 to 3 minutes. Now, where that gets long is if they want to process the feedback in that moment. And that's where I'm typically going to try to direct us to either a separate ad hoc one-on-one where we get into that deeper, or defer that to the next conversation in our one-on-one if there's not urgency around it. I try to not reserve, because sometimes, at least in my experience, sometimes if I try to reserve it for a one-on-one, it can feel to the other individual as if I've been holding back something from them. Now, that might be unique to the folks that are reporting to me. Like you said, there's preferences for other people, so I think it's important to consider those preferences, but at least that's been my approach to determining when is the right time to talk about feedback within the one-on-one context.
Mm-hmm. So Tuck, this next one, it's a tough question, so I'm gonna ask you to answer it first. Sound good?
Yes, please do.
How do you maintain boundaries within a one-on-one conversation?
Great question. I think it's important just to say right out the gate. In my one-on-one relationships and my relationships with my direct reports, I don't want it to just be about business. I don't want us to just be kind of always talking about work. On some level, I want us to have human-to-human conversations, even if within a one-on-one. Now, there are limits to that. What I'm not trying to do is I'm not trying to put myself out there and create confusion that I'm their therapist, for example. I want to be there for them, and I let them guide that conversation. I have been pretty fortunate over the time that I've been a manager and a leader that I haven't really run into many scenarios where people are crossing any boundaries with that. But I've had to coach some folks that have. And one of the important things that I think is key to remember is that it's a two-way street. You can let somebody be as open as possible, but if they're trying to ask you questions about yourself in that context, or if it's making you uncomfortable as a person, you also have your own boundaries that you need to maintain. And so I think when we're thinking about the context of a one-on-one or those types of relationships, you want to make sure that you create that boundary and do it in a way that is respectful to where they're at. So let's say, for example, I'm asking you, I'm going to put you on the spot. I'm asking you, our initial one-on-one question I always start with everybody that reports to me is how are you doing? How's home? How's life? How's work? And we just start there. And I kind of let whoever just take it wherever they want to go. But in this case, let's say that you had something significant going on in your personal life. And I was hearing you out and listening and just kind of like letting you get it off your shoulders a little bit. But let's say it's starting to bleed into the most of our one-on-one and that I can tell that you're getting more and more worked up. That might be a moment where I say, let's pause the conversation. Why don't you go take a beat? Why don't you go take a minute to go take a quick walk or take a few breaths or something like that, go get some water, and then we'll resume our conversation. Because you can start to see somebody spiraling in those moments, and it's a sign that they trust you, which I think is important to acknowledge. But again, you're not there to necessarily be a therapist in that moment. And again, it's so contextual, it's kind of hard to exactly say how you should do it in the moment. But I do think it's important to create a human relationship with somebody. But again, you have to know how to guide the conversation back to really the what's at hand, which is helping them grow, helping them work through whatever problems that they're having that's related to the work. What you're not trying to do is you're not trying to help them work through personal issues that are happening in their life. That's somewhere that you should probably start to draw a line, and you can help them figure out how to deal with that. Maybe you have some personal experience or context you can share with them, and that's fine. But again, that's going to be very, very specific to the individual. We've talked a little bit at least about the individual owning the conversation, owning the one-on-one. It's their time with you. When do you think it's appropriate for you as a manager to start adding topics to the one-on-one, even if they're the person that's owning the agenda?
I don't know if I'm breaking the rules here, Tuck, so you'll have to tell me. I always bring some amount of questions. I do anticipate that the person is driving the one-on-one, but I'm always gonna have probing questions that I've got in my back pocket, or specifics. So if I'm meeting with you, I might have a couple of specific questions around an account that I want to ask about. With a team member, it's checking in on XYZ growth, but I'm never gonna force it, especially if they have a full plate, right? It's important that I can bring those things to the table, but they can also be deferred for later. They're not high priority enough that I'm waiting until the one-on-one to bring them, but they're there in case we need to continue the conversation or fluff the conversation a bit more, and not fluff in a bad way, but dig in deeper, make it, I don't know, I'm thinking about Cool Whip for some reason. So we're making it fluffy with Cool Whip, but like making it a deeper conversation. So I always bring them, but know that I don't have to use them if the other individual is driving the conversation enough to not need them.
There is a difference between priming somebody for a conversation and not. So that's why I asked that question on if you add those items to the agenda, because for the questions that I feel aren't as urgent, I will keep those in my own notes. So I talked a little bit earlier about how I prepare for my week of one-on-ones, and I will come up with those questions that I'm curious about. They're typically more related to how the person thinks, or maybe around specific interests or things like that, to maybe ignite some deeper conversation, like you said. If I know that I want to have a deeper discussion around a very specific topic, that's when I'm going to add it to the agenda so that they can see it ahead of time, that they can prime themselves, and so I don't my goal there isn't to catch them off guard or anything like that. I don't want it to seem like that's what I'm doing, and so I try to add it beforehand so that they can also mentally prepare for that conversation when I am adding something to the agenda that's not added by them. One thing I think that it's really underrated on and not talked a whole lot about when it comes to one-on-ones is that it is talked a lot about in terms of not using one-on-ones for purely updates. But unfortunately, I think the way that people take that sometimes is that means you don't need to let your manager know what's going on with your work. I think that's a mistake. If your one-on-one is a key time for you and your manager to be having a conversation about your work, and you are shying away from giving any level of updates about what your work looks like, then you're not giving them the opportunity to understand and even praise you for the work that you're doing. That can be really dangerous because when it comes time for reviews or when it comes time for assessing growth or whatever that looks like for you, your manager might just not know all the things that you did, all the different things that you were involved in, because maybe you shied too much away from providing updates. Now, it's important that you don't just make your one-on-one a status update, right? Because that can just be an asynchronous Slack message or email or whatever you use. I'll get into the structure in a second, but what I do think is important, since I'm already on the topic, is that we're talking about the priorities that you're focusing on. That makes it really clear what your day-to-day is focusing on from a prioritization standpoint, and then that offers an opportunity for you and your manager to discuss if those priorities are correct or not. Or maybe it's praise because you've added additional priorities to your plate that they weren't expecting, but are delighted to hear that you're handling. And so the structure that I'm about to talk through handles that. Like I said earlier, we always check in with how we're doing. I like to prime it that way. A lot of our meetings, we actually do this thing in many of our team-based meetings where we talk about like where we're at feeling-wise for the day. And what I like about that, and we don't necessarily do the exact same thing in a one-on-one, but it's the same idea, is that you're understanding what that person's coming into the meeting with. If you're like me, I get really in my head about things, and if somebody's quiet or if somebody seems upset, I'm gonna project that that's me problem. I'm gonna be like, oh my gosh, what did I do? Like, what did I do to upset them? I should have known walking into this. But if you have this first check-in on how you're doing, you kind of get a lay of the land. Again, to the degree that they're willing to share. But an example of this could be like with Dan, for me, could be that maybe which isn't the case, I share a lot with Dan, but if I didn't want to share as much, it'd be like, oh, I have some things going on at home right now. It's pretty chaotic. And so he might notice that my energy's lower or that I might seem distracted throughout our one-on-one. But then he's clear on like where that's falling. Yeah. So he doesn't need to pry to figure out what's going on in my personal life. He just knows something's going on there that will provide context as to our conversation. But if it is something that's going on with work, oh, things are really chaotic, I feel like I can't prioritize, I feel like I've got too many things on my plate, okay, well then that gives him an idea of where to start focusing in on the conversation with me. So it's just a really good way to, and kind of, it disarms people very quickly when you just start a one-on-one with like that, rather than jumping right into like the very first, topic that's maybe a little bit heavy that you need to talk about.
For somebody who is very prone to jumping right in and talking about the stuff that's you want to talk about instead of taking a beat and maybe normalizing, it's been a good new habit to form, not only in one-on-ones, but in other meetings with my team members and on my projects and with clients. Like, I've leveraged this kind of across the board because I've seen some of the benefits that it's really had. And again, it's a good lesson to learn of like, okay, we don't have to immediately jump right into the work. We can build our human-to-human relationship first, and just kind of like take our armor off a little bit, for lack of better words, to get more comfortable with one another.
Where the next topic comes into play is around current priorities and how they're going. So like I mentioned earlier, this is not just going through a status update of everything you've done in the past 2 weeks. Instead, it is, what are your biggest rocks that you're focusing on and how are they going? And this is probably where I spend the most time focusing in on my coaching level conversations, because it could be about the actual priorities themselves. Are they the right priorities or not? Or do we need to have a coaching conversation about that? Or it could be that they're feeling stuck on something, and this might be a moment where I can help them feel unstuck or help guide them through that answer. And that's not saying that I'm even gonna have the answer, but I can help ask some questions to help them arrive at that answer. So that's probably where I end up spending the most of our one-on-one time on any given one-on-one with anybody, myself included with my boss, Dan. Like, that's probably where we spend the most of our time. Is that where you end up spending most of your coaching conversation time?
With you, definitely. I think with the individual contributors that I work with, it's some of the time is spent on there, but I think lesson learned and wins the next spoiler alert, we're spending a lot of time there as well. So it just depends on where they're at in their sort of career. Maybe newer people, newer to either their individual role or to the industry, they're going to probably spend a bit more time in the next couple of sections, or at least that's been my experience. And then as you kind of get more comfortable, you spend a lot of your time, I think, problem solving together.
Yeah.
So
you talked a little bit about lessons learned. What does that look like for you? So that's the next section of a one-on-one.
Oh, this was my favorite because I think the lessons learned category is something that like all humans can, resonate with. We all learn lessons, especially in business. And it's some of my favorite type of coaching to do because it's usually a lot of introspection of, okay, well, what can we do differently next time? How can we evaluate this situation differently? How can we assume better intent? How can we problem solve or get ahead of it? And it's a lot of like, let's pump the brakes and look within before we start looking around us. And that's kind of where I see the majority of the focus there. And it's easily one of my favorites.
Yeah, it doesn't surprise me that it's one of your favorites. It's really important because I think as a manager, being able to understand how and what they're learning at any given moment helps you be a better coach, because it could be that they put a lesson learned down that maybe scratches the surface on something. And that can be a prompt for you as their manager to say, actually, I think there's something below this that maybe you haven't even recognized in yourself yet. And it helps them even start to see kind of how that's starting to spin for them, that flywheel's going. And so I feel like this is probably one of the more important parts to make sure that we're also documenting really well.
Yeah.
Because this helps show their growth trajectory throughout any given period of time. I keep coaching profiles for all my direct reports, and it includes like different assessments that we've done, wins, learnings, all that kind of good stuff. And this is the section that I'm probably going to be referencing the most when it comes time to have like growth conversations or goal conversations that we talked a little bit about earlier. And then of course the next section is wins. So I similarly always want to know what is something that we should be celebrating. Obviously, in any given business, you're not going to be able to see everything that your direct reports are doing. And so even if you have seen it, it's important that you're talking about it. And so this section sometimes ends up being a section where the individual still adds their wins, but then this could also be somewhere where I add items that they haven't put down yet, but I see as a win for them. And so this one is important to go through every couple of weeks too, because it's also capturing the small wins along the way, because it's really easy to see, at least in our organization, I feel like it's really easy to see the bigger wins. It's like, oh, we have this release, or oh, we've signed this big contract, or whatever it might be. Those are the big wins that everybody sees, but there's so many small wins that get to those big wins. And if you don't take the time to look at this, then the person probably won't feel as appreciated. You won't have as good of an idea of what their day-to-day is looking like, how they should be celebrated. And I think it'll just lead to greater dissatisfaction if they're not feeling like they're being celebrated by you. So I'm sure wins are also equally as fun for you to go through.
They are fun, and you'll note that there are people who will happily self-report their wins, and then there are others who might be a bit more bashful about it. And I think being able to discern who you might have to report on behalf of a bit more is a good thing to note early on in your relationship with your team. Who are the people that you might want to keep a closer eye on, because they might not want to bring up those things for a number of different reasons. But I like to do that, even if we both go red in the face when we're talking about it, right? Like, some people don't like to be celebrated in that fashion, but if it's in a one-to-one relationship or a one-to-one conversation, I feel like even bringing those things up so that they know that you're seeing them is so important. So yes, I love wins, hyping up the team. There's really nothing better.
Yeah. And that lands us on the last topic, which is a topic that, at least for me, it doesn't often include a ton of time or even topics even every meeting, and that is around decisions. So essentially, what decisions are you needing to make that need my input being their manager. For me, our directors team has quite a bit of decision-making authority in our business. And so oftentimes if there's a decision to be made, it's typically going to be a bigger decision that's happening outside of the context of a one-on-one.
Yeah.
Occasionally there might be some like budgetary things that we need to talk through real quick, but oftentimes again those are happening in a Slack message or in a different context. So I'm curious if this ever comes up for you a whole lot.
Yes and no. A lot of these decisions that we're making with the product teams themselves, we're not typically doing it in a one-on-one unless that's going to be our time to check it off. So like a good example is somebody's wanting to do training or go to a conference. So they're bringing me a handful of ideas or suggestions. I'm probably not going to be able to make the decision right then and there, but I know that I have a takeaway to get a decision back to them. So it really just depends. I'd say maybe like 30-40% of the time there might be something in there, but much like you, it's not every single time. But I think it's good to have it there so that they know the door is always open.
Yeah. I agree. I think that, like I mentioned, we don't cover it a whole lot in my one-on-ones, but the reason I like to keep it there is I just want to make it clear with my team members at any given time that this is the moment to get unblocked by any kind of decision that we need to make. And if there's something that they're not sure about or that they approval on or something like that and anything up, I want this to be the time to get that out of the way. And so that's why I like to keep it, even if it's not used all the time, just to make sure that I get to confirm, like, is there anything that's in your way right now? And if so, then I, to your point, can make an action item to either go get that out of their way later, or maybe even sometimes I can do that right in that moment, which is super satisfying when that happens.
Yeah.
But typically, there's some follow-up afterwards. So we've talked a lot today about how to conduct one-on-ones really well, how to make sure that you're getting the most out of them, how to make sure that you're supporting your folks. But what we haven't talked about are the tools that we use. So at Crema, we primarily only use one tool. We use a growth platform called Lattice, and it covers a lot of different things for us, one-on-ones being one of them, weekly updates being another, and they kind of feed off of one another. And so if you're not already using a growth platform, definitely go check out Lattice. We're a little bit biased because we really like that product, but there's plenty out there, and it can be really helpful. You don't have to have a growth platform to conduct one-on-ones, but in an organization that is, even a small organization, it's helpful to see a bird's eye view of everybody in the organization, all the different feedback that's coming in. It gives you structure for goal setting, all that kind of good stuff.
Yeah. I don't think there should be any barrier of entry to one-on-ones. So if getting a tool isn't necessarily feasible for you, then really don't sweat it. But if you have the capability to leverage one, I highly recommend Lattice. It's pretty great.
Yeah, definitely. Obviously, we've gone through a lot of different content today, and this has been, and our approach to one-on-ones has been built over time, and it's going to continue to change. But there are probably 3 key books that at least have driven myself and probably Alison to a degree as well on how we conduct ourselves in one-on-ones. So the first one being The Coaching Habit. There's 7 questions within this book, and we'll probably put them up on the screen here. But this is really all about a posture that you'll hold as a leader, not only in one-on-ones, of course, throughout your organization in your day-to-day, but specifically in one-on-ones to make sure that you're being the best coach you can be for the folks that report to you. You want to talk a little bit about our second book here?
Multipliers. It is a required read for anybody at Crema. I think it should be a required read for anyone in business. Personally, it's such a good book. It really dives in on how to be a multiplier rather than a diminisher. And I'm not going to give too much away, but those are 2 key terms, and we use them every day at work. Yep. But it's really about growing the people around you and helping them to be multiplied. So multiplying others in the approach to the work, how you support one another, and how you encourage them to take bigger leaps. It's a fantastic read, so 10 out of 10, recommend.
We give it to every single person that joins Crema, so obviously we have to recommend it here. And then finally, and this book is actually on my goals, speaking of goals, for next month to reread. It's called Drive. It's by Daniel Pink, and it really gives you a great understanding of what motivates people. And there's not any one-on-one questions necessarily, at least that I can remember. Like I said, I have to reread it here soon, but there's nothing in there that you're going to directly pull and say this is exactly how I'm going to conduct a one-on-one, but it gives you context in how you might coach somebody and what really drives people to do their best work. And so highly recommend that book. It's not a required read, but many of our leaders here at Crema have read that book. And now that I've mentioned that I'm rereading it, it. Alison mentioned before this video that she's also going to be rereading it. So
It's been a minute.
we both really enjoy it.
Yeah, it is. It's good.
Thank you so much for watching today. I hope you got a lot out of this. If you liked it, go ahead and give this a thumbs up. It'll help other people like yourself find this video. Of course, don't forget to subscribe. And if you have any questions, just comment below. Our team is really great about sending these comments back to the individuals that recorded the videos so that you can get a response from us or other people on our team. And we'll see you next time. And hopefully this time it won't be 3 years later. Bye, everybody.